there are some Quranic verses, if you take them out of context and you go and you follow literalism, it may really be misunderstood. And unfortunately, we have a group in the Islamic tradition called Wahhabism. Wahhabism is literalist. And Wahhabism started in 18th century, very much following everything that is literal in the Quran and in the Hadith. When you interpret it, they say God could have interpreted. Why you are interpreting? It's so sick, like sticky to the literal approach, to the literal aspect of the Quran. Well, maybe God wanted you to interpret. He didn't want to say everything, so you find something. And that's why we have a huge tradition of interpretation of the Quran. Like Razi, very famous commentator of the Quran, wrote 30 volumes as interpretation of the Quran. But Wahhabism is not like a large group, it's a small group. I would say even not 0.5% of Muslim population. But unfortunately, and also I have to say that not all Wahhabis are violent. Some of these ideas, doctrines, can lead to violence because of the misunderstanding of the Quran. And I think ISIS people, they are coming from this Wahhabi tradition. They look at the Quran literally. Even Osama bin Laden came from the same tradition, unfortunately. Other groups, Al-Qaeda, used some of those, doctrines of Wahhabism. Now, it's not coming from the essence of religion, but it is that literalism leads to a certain level of extremism. Scholars of Islam are strongly opposing those ideas. The majority of Muslims are moderate. They are actually against extremism. And I can tell you, like Mr. Fethullah Gulen, for example, sent a statement against ISIS, saying that this is not Islamic, this is un-Islamic, and sent to Washington Post, to Wall Street Journal, to New York Times, to clearly indicates that ISIS is a violent terrorist group and not Islamic group. You shouldn't put Islam and ISIS together. They call it Islamic, but I call it un-Islamic. Remember, there is in the Quran that as a principle, you cannot step on an ant to kill it. Ant, A-N-T, this little creature. The Quran says you are not allowed to kill this. There is a chapter in the Quran named after ant, as chapter An-Naml. Now, how such a religion that is so much concerned about life, not only life of human beings, life of any creature, would allow the beheading of people? We see ISIS people are beheading, and we don't know even what was the guilt of those people who are beheaded. That's why I would say the misunderstanding of the Quran, the misunderstanding of the religion of Islam, and people by nature sometimes they can go astray. It is really a problem in the Muslim world, and I think Muslim world should speak out against it, that this is not Islamic. Unfortunately, Muslims are not very well organized to speak out in an organized way. That's why scholars like Mr. Gulen would send to some newspapers to make sure that his voice is heard. It's important, I think. And this, when you take some verses out of its context, you can find anything in the Quran, a reference to anything. And I like to give you a kind of story, which includes a joke a little bit. after this serious issue, it's good to have a little bit much more flexible thing. We have in Turkey, my home country, also my country is the United States and Turkey, both countries. In Turkey, we have a group of people called Bektashis. Bektashis are very good. By the way, if we have Bektash among us, please don't take personal. Because on one occasion I mentioned this and a Bektash came to me and said that I was a little bit upset why you mentioned this. They asked Bektashi. Bektashis are mystics, Sufis, but they are a little bit loose Sufis. They asked one of them, they say, why don't you pray? He doesn't pray. Well, Sufis normally, they do 5 daily prayers and they do more even. He said, because God says don't pray. In the Quran, God says don't pray. That's why I don't pray. Well, is there a verse in the Quran which says don't pray? If you look at the Quran, yes, there is a verse. God says don't pray. Then they ask him, they say, why don't you read the rest of the verse? He says, because I have not memorized the entire Quran. Now, what is the rest of the verse? The rest of the verse says, yes, don't pray when you are drunken. In the early Islam, alcohol was not prohibited. Muslims would go to pray, and they were drunken, and they were not knowing what they were saying. So the Quran said, don't pray when you are drunken. Start your praying when you are sober. So Bektashi takes this first part of the verse and says, God says don't pray. That's why I don't pray. Well, I think if you take verses out of context, you may find references not to pray even in the Quran. But I think everything in the Quran should be considered within its context.